Hey, so I'm 25 books into the 100-book challenge, going slower than I thought it would go because, in large part, I've been dealing with a bunch of very scary medical stuff. Turns out I'm good, but I've been a little distracted. We're going to go through, instead of the tier rank, video format that I am tired of, here's the stack of books. I have ranked them in ascending order from ass to class. The worst, unfortunately, was actually this short story collection by James Tiptree Jr. This is the first Tiptree that I have read. This is her first book and her first collection of short stories. Real name, Alice Sheldon. Interesting author, and unfortunately this material, which is her earlier stories, just kind of hit the buttons that tend to irritate me. Tiptree is a really important figure, especially in the American New Wave, and I had pretty high expectations for this, but this is mostly her pulp stories, her earlier work that doesn't have the sophistication that I was expecting, I guess, or hoping for. And people have told me after the fact that her later stories are better, and her really famous stories are not in this. So I guess this collection has a spotty reputation. I didn't care for it. I thought it had the sort of performative glibness that you get in a lot of pulp material. It reminded me, I hate to say it, of Heinlein a lot in its tonality. I found it difficult to focus on. I found it difficult to read. There's a couple of stories that I think are pretty good. The first two are the best. And this is not a nail in the coffin for Tiptree. I want to read her longer fiction, and I also want to read her more well-known short stories. But unfortunately, this was a disappointment. Then Drinking Sapphire Wine by Tanith Lee. It's got a great cover. It is a sequel to Don't Bite the Sun, a much better book. And I thought that this sequel, it just felt like a tack on to the end of Don't Bite the Sun. It's like a utopian, dystopian, far future, sort of like City in the Stars by Arthur C. Clarke, but a little poppier, and involves a lot of made-up teenager slang from the future, which is usually a bad sign. That's usually irritating when science fiction authors do that. It doesn't really work ever. And it's the case in this, it's the case in the other book as well, but I just thought that this was almost entirely redundant with Don't Bite the Sun, and not nearly as good of a book. In fact, that is the only Tanith Lee book I've ever read that I didn't like. Next is The Wind from Nowhere by JG Ballard. This is his redacted first novel. He disowned it. He said that it was quote-unquote hack work, and it kind of is a very different Ballard. This does not have the Ballard polish. It does not have the Ballard intensity and density and sophistication. It reads like kind of an airport disaster novel with little flourishes around the edges of Ballard's talents as a writer. Certainly not a bad book, but had I read this as my first Ballard, I don't know that I would have been that interested in Ballard. It kind of reads like a slightly done-up James Bond novel, and I found it lacking in a lot of ways, but interesting in some. I would say if you've read other James Ballard novels and you're curious about it, then probably worth reading. The Truth and Other Stories is a posthumously published collection of Stanislaw Lem's short stories, and these are recently translated to English. Only 3 of these stories were translated to English prior to the publication of this. I found this material uneven, but the highs are truly incredible. It does not attain to the level of Lem in Solaris, but the interest in First Contact with Aliens in Solaris is evident here in these stories published between 1950 and 1993. The most interesting ones are the ones that deal with AI. And Lem's vision of AI bears an awful lot of resemblance to a lot of the utopian AI talking heads, a lot of the Joe Rogan types who are talking about how we're giving birth to a new cosmic consciousness, that AI is like midwifing a new god. Something that Brian Johnson talks about a lot. That material is definitely the most interesting. Lem in these, and of course it's translated work, so maybe in the original Polish it read differently, but he has pacing issues, a lot of flatlining, and then big spikes of action, sometimes disorientingly so. But a lot of the stories are pretty good. The best one is The Friend, published in 1959. I think if you can find a copy of this book, It's worth it just to read The Friend. There are a few others that are good. In large part, they're sort of forgettable. Not as good as Solaris, but almost nothing is. Then The Edge of Running Water, written by William Sloane, a semi-forgotten weird fiction writer who only put out 2 novels, this one and To Walk the Night. This one came out afterwards in the 1950s. No, I'm sorry, 1939. Reads like a book from the 60s or 70s. It's a sort of genre mixer, like pulp, almost noir, mixed with cosmic horror, mixed with science fiction, sort of like a Frankenstein story, overly dependent on characterization. It's just not that interesting. It's well written enough that you can burn through it in like a day or two, but ultimately just not much happening here that doesn't feel hackneyed at this point. Probably much less so in 1939, but I just didn't find it all that interesting. In fact, why is it above the Lem in this ranking? That was a mistake. This belongs lower down. It's fine. It's perfectly fine. Diverting. It's more of an entertainment than like an interesting piece of literature. It is collected in an NYRB with his other novel called The Rim of Morning. So William Sloane, a somewhat celebrated figure in cosmic horror, but I would not go out of my way to read that one. Some of you will be mad to see Way Station at this point in the list. I didn't really love it that much. I thought that it was not that well written, pretty saccharine and fairly sort of like predictable. There's one bit where the main character has a friend who may be a hologram. It has a lot of like fairly intense sort of pathos. That's interesting to me. For me, this was a book that didn't quite live up to its reputation, and it doesn't live up to City, which I think is a better book. So I randomly rolled Edge of Running Water by Sloane, and then I think 2 books later randomly rolled this, his other novel, which was slightly funny. Walk the Night is better than Edge of Running Water. This was his first one. It's about a guy investigating his friend's death, going home to explain the circumstances, the fairly mysterious and weird circumstances of the friend's death to the friend's father. And there's a romance in the middle of this mystery that might explain the mystery, and the 2 men are trying to piece together what happened and how. Pretty good. This was a much more interesting read. It is better written. It's written more powerfully. It does feel a little bit dated, but a decent piece of cosmic horror. I think the ending especially is pretty good, and it's especially pretty good considering when it was published, 1937. It has, even though it is a little dated, it has aged better than Edge of Running Water, I think. If I were to pick between the 2 novels to read, it would definitely be this one, clearly, because I ranked it higher. Thorns was the first book that I read as part of this second and greatest of all 100-book challenges. I've already talked about this on the channel, but I thought that it was okay. It's not the strongest Silverberg. I think Downward to the Earth certainly is better than this. World Inside, probably better than this, although it's been so long since I read that one. Who knows? But I thought this suffered from quite a few problems. However, it is his breakout novel. It's his pivot point. It's published 1967, and it's Silverberg becoming Silverberg. It's emerging from the pulp chrysalis to become the new wave weirdo that we know and love him for being. It's about a guy who gets essentially abducted by aliens that he's meant to make diplomatic contact with. They reformat his body surgically so he looks barely human, goes back to Earth and has to reintegrate back into human society, has a difficult time doing so. It goes to some strange places. It's okay. I thought it was decent with problems. Space Chantey by R.A. Lafferty. This is my least favorite Lafferty. It is a play on old space opera, stuff like Van Vogt, Voyage of the Space Beagle, and Star Trek. I think it's sort of a satire thereof, a satire of the heroic space captain figure. It's kind of like Star Trek original series if all the crew members were constantly stabbing each other in the back and seeking their own pleasures, planet side, and so on. Also a science fictional retelling of the Odyssey by Homer. It is decent. It is nowhere near as interesting or good as Pastmaster or Reefs of Earth. Furthest by Suzette Haden Elgin is her first true novel. There was one that came before that was a fix-up of 2 novellas. This is, I called it the first of the Coyote Peterson books previously, but it is Coyote Jones, in fact, an agent of the Trigalactic Intelligence Service. And if you've read Joanna Russ, you probably would like Elgin as I liked Elgin. This is a slightly less literarily experimental Joanna Russ novel, and in fact, the follow-up book to this is the source material for Russ's novel, The Two of Them. It's about this man, Coyote Jones, going to a planet called Furthest. That's the furthest flung, most distant from the galactic core member nation of like a galactic United Nations equivalent body of governance that rotates its leadership every 20 years. Furthest is up in the rotation, and no one knows anything about the political system of Furthest or the intentions of the person who's going to become whatever, prime minister or president. So they send Coyote Jones out to Furthest for fact-finding, for espionage, and he has to make an ethical decision in the midst of a moral quandary around the political system that disadvantages women. It's as intense as Russ, not as difficult to read as Russ, actually a little edgier almost in this than in Russ. Not as well written, but worth reading, I think. And then we have Don't Bite the Sun by Tanith Lee. This is the first book that Drinking Sapphire Wine was a sequel to. I think this is great. It was written in the 70s. It reads like it was written in the 90s about rave culture. It's about pseudo-teenagers who are living in a dome city whose entire lives are dedicated to doing drugs and partying and so on. Whether deliberately or not, it's kind of a retelling of The Machine Stops by E.M. Forster. Not as good as Machine Stops, but great piece of sort of like morally ambiguous utopian/dystopian fiction. Does have the slang issue, but I think that it's a very interesting book. This is her in a more playful mode than I've seen her elsewhere, but she's playful without being frivolous. Drinking Sapphire Wine felt frivolous to me. This certainly doesn't. It has that superficial appearance, but I think that there's a real moral depth to this one that one lacks. Then Raymond Chandler, The Big Sleep. Sometimes you got to mix it up. Every once in 100 books, you have to read something that isn't science fiction so you can remain well-rounded and mentally healthy. I had never read it before. I know close to nothing about crime fiction, and it's a pond that I am beginning to dip my feet in. That's probably not the turn of phrase, but I thought that this was good. In some of its dimensions, it has aged quite poorly, but the writing is so strong, and he was so adept at turning a clever phrase and writing similes. I found it captivating. I found it so captivating that I managed to complete it, even in the midst of the worst, most psychologically stressful period of my string of health scares. Still read The Big Sleep and still enjoyed it. I think that that's a real testament to Raymond Chandler. Planet of Adventure by Jack Vance. That's actually 4 books. City of the Chosh, Servants of the Wank, renamed later by some cowardly publishers, Servants of the Wannock. But here on Bookpilled forever, it will be Servants of the Wank. The Deer and the Noom. This is Vance writing planetary romance. A guy is shot down along with his co-pilot, crashes on this planet, Chai. His co-pilot is executed in front of his eyes, and he has to wander around this alien planet, learning about all of its many cultures and trying to figure out a way to get back to Earth. And he's surprised to find that the planet is peopled by 4 distinct species of aliens, each with its own like subspecies or subcultures of alien. And all 4 have human servants or humanoid servants who are probably derived from a common genetic stock of humans that were brought to Chai as slave labor. Overall, I found the books sort of mixed, but the really strong parts are these alien cultures, much more so than like the sociology, the political commentary that's in there that can kind of be eye-rolling. And overall, I don't know that the meta plot really pays off all that well, but the fine detail and the work with the aliens, like the world building, I guess you can call it, is wonderful. And in terms of escapist adventure fiction, this is up there. The Drought by JG Ballard. I read this before I read Crash, and as I said in the Crash review, I don't trust my opinion of it so much because I felt like it took me a long time to key in on Ballard and to be able to read Ballard properly. This is the second of his major disaster novels, if you don't count Wind from Nowhere, after The Drowned World, also called The Burning World in a different edition. Very potent and very specifically surrealist. And if you read it, adjust your reading to the way that Ballard writes and just sort of bask in the symbolism and the atmosphere. The Drought is about, check this out, it's about a drought, a global drought, how people cope with it, and how some people yearn for and celebrate the annihilation that comes to them in the drought. Fascinating book. As with a lot of Ballards, it's not a book that I particularly enjoyed reading at the time, but by the time I finished it, you just kind of have this eerie tingle of having been witness to something fairly special and weird. Rogue Moon by Algis Budrys. A science fiction classic that does not have as much science fiction in it as you might expect. It's about what's called an artifact, the artifact discovered on the moon. That's this big structure that's sort of like the Zone in Roadside Picnic, where you go into the building and if you don't move through it in a very specific sequence of movements and postures, performing very specific actions, the building kills you. And the researchers find a way to teleport people to the moon to try to map out a course through the artifact. It's really a character study of two men, the guy who's running this research project and this daredevil figure that he recruits to be the main scout through the artifact. And it's a comparison of their models of masculine virtue, and I apply that sort of gendered language because that's what the book definitely does. And it's a meditation on an individual's relationship with death and also an examination of the meaning of leadership. Potently written very much actually like the Strugatskys. Budrys was known as much for his criticism as for his fiction. I've not read his criticism, but I've read this. It is definitely way above the cut for the era that it was published in, 1960. I was impressed by its intensity and its maturity and its willingness to stray from the conventions of science fiction. The Island of Dr. Moreau by H.G. Wells, I think is a great book. It's not as good as Time Machine, and it's not as good as War of the Worlds. It is thematically more enigmatic than both of those books, and it reads the most like a piece of contemporary fiction. In fact, I compared it to Ballard, and there's probably a much longer conversation to be had about that comparison. It's his response to vivisection, which was something that was controversial at the time that he wrote it, but was still being practiced. That's where you perform surgery on conscious living animals. It's one of the first uplift stories in science fiction where this mad scientist performs vivisection upon animals and turns them into facsimiles of human beings. He makes them bipedal, and because of their bipedalism, it produces half sapience in them, where they're able to speak sort of broken English. For its time, this was a hard science book. The science has, since obviously been debunked, but the most interesting thing about this book is its allegorical subtext that, to me, very obviously is a comment, A, on British imperialism, and B, most conspicuously, upon the American slavery system. And Wells disavowed that comparison, said that it was not a direct metaphor for anything other than the trial of Oscar Wilde, which is a piece of history that I don't know nearly enough about to comment on if that makes sense. To me, to my tiny brain. That makes no sense, or certainly less sense than it being allegory for slavery. I think when you read it, you will see what I mean, and there's some interesting and ambiguous and potentially troubling semiotics, I guess I could say if I wanted to be annoying, in the portrayal of, in this metaphor, if it is a metaphor for imperialism and the animals are imperial subjects, then their comparison to half-conscious animals, it raises some interesting questions, some genuinely interesting questions about what Wells is saying, how he's saying it, his commentary about race science, if he is making commentary about race science or comments about race science. It's a big muddle. It's a big, weird, fascinating muddle. Also a very exciting story that is crazier than you would expect. There is some body horror in this that is pretty unnerving. And I think that this belongs as much in the horror genre as it does in science fiction. I really like this book. I think that that's a big recommend. That's one of them that's in public domain. You can read for free. I think that probably describes none of the others, now that I'm looking at them. Parable of the Sower by Butler, I just finished. If this was a better constructed piece of fiction, this would be in the top 15. Of all of the books I've ever read in my life, there is no book where there is a greater discrepancy between the contents and the cover. This book is wall-to-wall brutality. This is knee-deep in the dead. This is playing Doom on the hardest difficulty. Just blood and guts, human misery, suffering, exploitation. My mind boggles at all of the YA readers who probably picked this up because this was marketed to them and got that kind of an experience unexpectedly. It's about a United States where most of the infrastructure in the country has been obliterated through privatization, and most of the material comforts that we're used to have vanished, and there's a tiny little relic population of middle-class laborers who live in a walled community outside of Los Angeles in the midst of an increasingly violent and chaotic wasteland outside of the walls, peopled by roving bands of addicts to a drug that gives them orgasmic pleasure when they look at flame. So they become pyromaniacs, and nothing works, and the police are all corrupt, and there's a fire department, but it's privatized. You have to bribe them to fight fires. But people still are obligated to go to work, and the work looks increasingly like various forms of slavery. I have a couple quibbles with the book. The Earthseed subplot I don't think is as interesting as Butler wanted it to be. I don't think that the characters are all as interesting as she hoped that they were, and in terms of the plot, it's sort of meandering. I think Dawn and Kindred are like better novels than this, but this is my favorite Butler. None of those three books, especially not this one, telegraphed to me before I read them how incredibly dark they were, how incredibly serious they were. Butler is the real article. She is someone who deserves all the attention that she is getting and more by merit of the strength of her material. City of the Singing Flame by Clark Ashton Smith. This is the best weird fiction that I've read. It's the best cosmic horror. He's definitely, like, hands down my favorite of the big three of weird fiction. I like him way more than Lovecraft and way more than Robert E. Howard. Smith didn't seem to have the other two's racial preoccupations, which definitely does a lot of favors for this material in comparison to theirs. Even that stuff aside, I think Smith was a better writer. There's material in here that was a big influence on Jack Vance, especially in the Dying Earth stories, and it reads sort of like a cross between Jack Vance and Clive Barker, and Cordwainer Smith actually is someone that I compared him to. This is more fun reading to me, certainly than Parable of the Sower, but this isn't like high literature, but this is as good as I've seen weird fiction be. Cross of Fire by Barry Malzberg, published 1982. This is his first to last science fiction novel. Just put out a video about how Malzberg, who passed away recently, is my favorite science fiction writer. This is an examination of the psychology of totalitarianism and its relationship with religious fundamentalism as experienced through the hallucinations, the induced hallucinations of this subject as part of psychotherapy, where he experiences the martyrdom of various historical real-world religious martyr figures, including Christ, as his quote-unquote real life unravels. Very obscure book, very, very intense book, and like all of Malzberg's best books, which is really, what I'm saying there is all of Malzberg's books, is as much a piece of satire as it is a piece of political commentary or like experimental fiction or psychological study. Next is Tactics of Conquest, also by Malzberg. This is a satire of the chess world that operates as a meta-satire of the science fiction, publishing, and reading world. I think this is one of the most interesting pieces of satire that I've read. A much more serious book than it appears on its surface, or that it appears to be for most of it until the last little bit. I won't spoil anything, but this is a legitimately great piece of literature that is also very funny. It's about two chess grandmasters who are playing a chess tournament with the stakes being the fate of half of the entire human population of the universe, because we've been taken captive by aliens who have assigned the forces of good and evil in the human universe to be represented by these two men who were childhood adversaries and are both psychos. This book is not remembered at all, but when it is remembered, it's remembered because Malzberg fleshed it out from a short story over the course of 4 days into novel length, and he described it as being full of filler. Even those parts I think are great. I think it's a testament to how good of a writer Malzberg was, that even material that he considered to be hack work is still head and shoulders above even great celebrated pieces of genre fiction that I've covered here. This might be a little more accessible than something like Beyond Apollo, or certainly Cross of Fire, or certainly the one that's coming up next. The runner-up for best book is The Destruction of the Temple, also by Barry Malzberg. If you have read Crash, I recommend reading this as well. This was published the year after Crash, and I think it was a commentary on Crash. But this is its own thing. This is even more intense than Beyond Apollo. It is even weirder, more nonlinear, more fractional, harder to follow, but better than Beyond Apollo. I think. This one is almost impossible to nutshell. It's about a student in the future who goes to a New York that has been walled off. He goes into the city as part of a research project to recreate through reenactment the JFK assassination, recruits actors from the local population to play the principal characters, JFK and Jackie Onassis, so on, Lyndon Johnson. And through these reenactments, he betrays them and they take him captive. And then there are flash backwards to American history, sort of like in Cross of Fire, where there's descriptions of the experience of being politically martyred, largely along racial lines. And there are recurrent odd episodes of someone going to buy the car to bring to the JFK assassination, for the JFK assassination, for JFK to be assassinated in, and it's just very chaotic and strange. If you're into the really fringe part of Philip K. Dick, the political end of Philip K. Dick, I think that you will like this. I think that this is Malzberg's most serious book, at least that I have read. And this is probably my favorite Malzberg. It's certainly toe-to-toe with Beyond Apollo. Beyond Apollo is more historically important, but and much better known than this, but I think this might be a better book. And then number one, finally, you could probably guess what it was, is Crash by JG Ballard. This is not only one of the best science fiction books I've ever read, one of the best pieces of fiction I've ever read. Sort of a tough book to recommend because the material is so incredibly extreme. It's like inviting people to take a trip to mental hell. Hey, weekend in hell. I had to read it in fits and starts. I had to read it in chunks of like 10, 20 pages at a time because it's so incredibly intense. It's also so internally redundant, where it's just sequences of scenes of sexual imagery related to violence around car crashes and sexual arousal around car crashes. And that is merely the briefest and most mercifully vague sketch of the actual material of Crash. The way these things function in Crash, the way Crash functions as a piece of fiction is truly eye-opening. I feel that not only it reframed a lot of science fiction for me, a lot of fiction, period, it like gave me a new model of thinking about the things that fiction can do, but it also kind of reframed certain parts of my life, certain elements of how I respond to the world, or how I think about the media, how I think about technology, or like there's a heightened level of awareness, of self-awareness around these things, of how maybe my sense of personhood might be shaped and influenced by the things that I consume. Not that reading it is going to unlock superpowers in you or produce some kind of like spiritual ecstasy or whatever, but it's just, it does at the highest level what fiction can do insofar as there is like a utility proposition in reading fiction. Crash is one of those books. So I both do and do not recommend Crash. It is virtually without peer, even in context with Ballard's other works. I have not read Atrocity Exhibition, which is closely related to this, but this is a book that stands kind of on its own. If you want more, Patreon's $5. There's like 140 videos up there. I do individual book reviews, including for all of these. There will be longer form content on the YouTube channel. Again, I've just been behind the ball, and there will be more videos here on the main channel soon. So thanks for watching and hanging out, and I'll see you soon.